Case 1, Hyphernkemberly Dorvilier, Pemberton Township, 2015. It was a bitterly cold Friday night, January 16, 2015, when the quiet neighborhood of Pemberton Township, New Jersey, was jolted awake by the sight of flames. Just after 11 p.m., residents along Simontown Road saw a small fire burning at the curbside. At first, they thought it was someone burning trash, a winter bonfire maybe. But the scene didn't look right. The fire was too concentrated, and a young woman stood beside it in silence, holding a red gas can. When one neighbor approached and asked what she was doing, she calmly replied that she was burning dog waste. There was no anger in her tone, just eerie composure, but within moments the smell of gasoline and something far worse filled the air. The neighbor realized in horror that what was burning wasn't refuse, it was a baby. The neighbor rushed forward, screaming for help, and knocked the gas can from her hands. Police were called immediately, and while waiting for emergency responders, the neighbor and his wife tried to put out the flames with water and a blanket. The woman stood back, watching. She didn't run, but when sirens grew louder, she made a brief attempt to leave before being restrained until officers arrived. When paramedics reached the scene, they found the newborn, still alive but critically injured. She was rushed to Lourdes Hospital, where doctors discovered third-degree burns covering more than 60% of her body. The medical examiner later confirmed that the baby girl had been born alive before the fire. Despite 2 hours of desperate effort, she succumbed to her injuries shortly after midnight. The woman at the scene was identified as 22-year-old Hyphernkemberly Dorvilier. She lived only a short walk away in a modest home on the same street. Investigators pieced together what had happened earlier that evening. Alone and terrified, Dorvilier had given birth in her bathroom, silently, without medical help or anyone's knowledge. For months, she had concealed her pregnancy. Her family and co-workers never suspected. After the delivery, instead of calling for assistance or surrendering the child under New Jersey's safe haven law, she wrapped the baby in towels, carried her outside, poured gasoline, and set her on fire. Detectives from the Burlington County Prosecutor's Office and Pemberton Police Department spent days reconstructing the timeline. Inside Dorvilier's home, they found blood-stained towels and evidence of childbirth. A red plastic gas can sit near the front steps. The motive was as senseless as it was tragic. Investigators concluded she had panicked, fearing discovery, and tried to erase all traces of the pregnancy. The medical examiner's report, confirming the baby had taken breaths before the fire, transformed what could have been a case of neglect into one of deliberate homicide. During interrogation, Dorvilier said little. She answered questions softly, rarely lifting her eyes from the table. Detectives described her demeanor as distant, neither defiant nor overtly remorseful, simply detached. She offered no detailed explanation beyond saying she didn't know what to do. Prosecutors charged her with murder, aggravated manslaughter, and endangering the welfare of a child. The story spread rapidly, shocking not only New Jersey but the entire country. In a small township where neighbors still left their doors unlocked, the idea of a mother ending her newborn's life in such a way was beyond comprehension. At trial, the prosecution presented forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, and hospital records showing that the child had lived briefly after birth. The defense did not contest the facts, but argued mental and emotional collapse. They described Dorvilier as overwhelmed and suffering from postpartum trauma, claiming she had no clear awareness of her actions. Witnesses described her as a quiet, respectful woman who worked in a local store and rarely drew attention to herself. Those who knew her couldn't reconcile the person they remembered with the horror of what had happened. On February 29, 2016, Dorvilier stood before Judge Rochelle Gazinski and pleaded guilty to aggravated manslaughter, admitting that she had caused her newborn's death. During sentencing on April 22, 2016, Judge Gazinskaya addressed the courtroom, her voice heavy with emotion. She told Dorvilier, "You took away a life that had just begun. This community will never understand why the judge sentenced her to 30 years in state prison under New Jersey's No Early Release Act, requiring that she serve at least 85%, roughly 25 and a half years, before being eligible for parole." Dorvilier showed little visible emotion as the sentence was read. Today, she is housed at the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility for Women in Clinton, New Jersey. By the time she can apply for parole, she will be nearing 50. Pemberton Township still remembers that night, the quiet street illuminated by firelight, the disbelief that followed, and the aching question of how fear could turn into something so destructive. In the aftermath, Burlington County authorities launched new awareness campaigns around the state's safe haven law. Hospitals and police stations posted clear signs reminding residents that any parent can safely and anonymously surrender a newborn, no questions asked. Local volunteers began speaking at schools and clinics, sharing the story as a plea to choose help over panic. For many, that was the only way to make sense of a tragedy that should never have happened. A decade later, the memory lingers like smoke in winter air. The image of that young woman standing silently beside the flames remains one of New Jersey's most haunting snapshots of desperation. A reminder that behind even the darkest acts, there is sometimes a moment of choice where tragedy could have been prevented, if only someone had known the truth sooner. Case 2. Chevonne Thomas, The Tragedy on Park Boulevard, Camden, New Jersey, 2012. It was late on September 2, 2012, when a trembling 911 call came from a small apartment on Park Boulevard in Camden, New Jersey. On the line was 33-year-old Chevonne Thomas, her voice cracking between confusion and eerie composure. "Something's wrong with my son," she whispered to the dispatcher, her tone drifting between panic and detachment. The call grew increasingly incoherent, moments of pleading interrupted by long, vacant silences. Then the line went dead. When police arrived minutes later, what they found defied comprehension. Chevonne stood in the kitchen, trembling, her hands streaked with blood. Upstairs, her 2-year-old son, Zari, lay lifeless. His small body had been brutally mutilated, and his head had been placed inside the freezer. Before officers could even react, Chevonne grabbed a knife and turned it on herself, collapsing to the floor. By the time medics reached her, she was gone. The crime sent shockwaves through Camden. Even veteran detectives wept that night. What could drive a mother, by all accounts loving and protective, to commit such horror? As investigators pieced together her life, the answer was as tragic as the crime itself. Chevonne was not a monster. She was a woman unraveling under the weight of severe mental illness. Diagnosed with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, she had fought for years to be stable enough to raise her son. Neighbors described her as warm, funny, and utterly devoted to Zari, often seen pushing his stroller through the park or laughing with him by the swings. But behind the gentle smile, she battled inner chaos. She had lost custody of Zari once after a psychotic episode, only regaining him months later when she appeared to have recovered. By 2012, however, she had stopped taking her medication, and her grip on reality was slipping fast. On the night of the tragedy, that fragile stability collapsed. In the 9/11 recording later released, Chevonne's voice swings from confusion to terror. She accuses others of hurting her son, then moments later admits she did it herself. She speaks of hearing voices, taunting, commanding, pushing her into a darkness she couldn't fight. When police entered, she looked blank, as if disconnected from the world around her. The medical examiner confirmed that Zari died quickly and did not suffer, but that detail did little to soothe the city's collective heartbreak. Because Chevonne took her own life, there would be no arrest, no trial, no courtroom reckoning, only endless questions and unimaginable grief. The aftermath was a reckoning for New Jersey's child protection system. Records revealed that social workers had returned Zari to his mother's care despite concerns about her mental health, and had failed to verify whether she was still receiving treatment. In the wake of the tragedy, the state overhauled its monitoring process, introducing new safeguards for parents struggling with mental illness. At Zari's funeral, his tiny white casket was surrounded by flowers and teddy bears. Family members described him as a bright, joyful boy who loved to dance and make people laugh. There were tears, but also anger. Anger at a system that recognized Chevonne's illness, yet left her isolated and untreated. The case of Chevonne Thomas remains one of Camden's most haunting tragedies. A story not of pure evil, but of a mother lost in her own mind, a system stretched too thin, and a child whose life ended before it ever truly began. It stands as a painful reminder that mental illness, when left untreated, can destroy even the deepest love, and that sometimes the greatest danger isn't found in hatred, but in heartbreak. Case 3. Krisla, Rezireksyon, the Starvation of Christiana Glenn, Irvington, New Jersey, 2011 to 2016. When paramedics entered the small apartment on Elmwood Avenue in Irvington in May 2011, the air was heavy with the scent of neglect, stale food, sweat, and silence. On the living room floor lay 8-year-old Christiana Glenn, motionless, frail, and starved nearly to death. She weighed barely 40 pounds. Her 2 siblings, a 6-year-old boy and a 7-year-old girl, were found nearby, so weak and malnourished they could not stand. They had been hiding behind a boarded wall, terrified and silent. Their mother, 34-year-old Krisla Rezireksyon, also known as Veneto Vilde, stood nearby, disturbingly calm. She told first responders that Christiana had fallen down the stairs, but within minutes, police knew this wasn't an accident. It was a house of horror. Christiana's body told a story no words could. She was covered in open sores, bruises, and scars. The medical examiner later testified that she died not just from starvation, but from untreated trauma, a broken femur that her mother never brought to a doctor. Instead, Rezireksyon poured salt and gasoline into the wound and covered it with cornmeal. The pain must have been unbearable. She never received medical care. By the time help arrived, she had endured months of malnutrition and torture that no child should ever face. The surviving children were immediately taken into protective custody. They told investigators about the life they had endured inside that apartment, how they were locked away from sunrise to nightfall, with only a bowl of water mixed with white paste, forced to kneel on metal oven grates until their skin blistered. They were told this was discipline, that fasting and suffering would drive out the demons their mother claimed lived inside them. When detectives searched the apartment, they found handwritten journals filled with strange religious notes about purification and sin. These pages became some of the most disturbing evidence prosecutors ever presented in Essex County. Rezireksyon had moved her family to Irvington, hoping to start fresh, but what unfolded behind those walls was a reign of terror masked as spiritual correction. Prosecutors argued that she weaponized faith, twisting it into justification for torture. They said she believed starvation and pain could save her children's souls. What it did instead was destroy them. After nearly 5 years of investigation and pre-trial delays, the case finally went to trial. On March 22, 2016, a jury found Krisla Rezireksyon guilty of aggravated manslaughter in Christiana's death, as well as multiple counts of aggravated assault and child endangerment. Judge Ronald D. Ravin presided over the sentencing that summer. On July 26, 2016, he handed down a total of 45 years in New Jersey State Prison, 25 of those years for aggravated manslaughter under the state's No Early Release Act, requiring her to serve at least 21 years, 3 months, and a day before she can even be considered for parole. In the courtroom, family members cried quietly as the judge spoke. No one could understand how a mother could look at her starving child and do nothing. The prosecution called the case one of the worst instances of prolonged child abuse ever seen in Essex County. Today, Krisla Rezireksyon remains behind bars. Her surviving children were adopted by loving families and have since lived far from the public eye. The apartment on Elmwood Avenue has long been vacated, but the memory of what happened there still lingers in the community. Christiana's story became a rallying cry for child advocates across New Jersey, a reminder that faith can never excuse cruelty and that silence can cost lives. In the years since her death, residents of Irvington have held small memorials in Christiana's name. They remember her not for the horror she endured, but for the joy she was once known for. The little girl who loved to sing in church and draw with her siblings. Her life, though short, forced a reckoning with how easily abuse can hide in plain sight. Her suffering changed the laws, the systems, and the hearts of those who vowed that no child would ever be failed like that again. Case 4, Nakira Griner, the murder of little Daniel Jr., Bridgeton, New Jersey, 2019 to 2025. It was a cold February night in Bridgeton, New Jersey, when a frantic 911 call came through around 6:30 p.m. on February 8, 2019. On the line was 24-year-old Nakira Griner, her voice trembling as she reported her 2-year-old son, Daniel Griner Jr., missing. She told police she had been attacked while walking with him in a stroller, and when she came to, the stroller was gone, and so was her son. Within minutes, the community mobilized. Police, firefighters, and volunteers scoured the neighborhood, combing through streets, fields, and wooded areas, desperate to find the little boy. The next morning, the search ended in heartbreak. When detectives returned to Nakira's home to clarify her story, inconsistencies emerged immediately. Surveillance footage showed no sign of the alleged attack or the stroller she described. Detectives began to suspect that the story was a lie. With the help of cadaver dogs, investigators searched her yard again, and there, under a shallow layer of dirt and debris, they found the charred and dismembered remains of 2-year-old Daniel Jr. The discovery sent shock waves through the tight-knit community. The medical examiner determined that Daniel had died from blunt force trauma before his body was set on fire. Detectives soon realized that Nakira's report of an abduction had been an attempt to conceal the truth. Under questioning, she changed her story several times, first claiming her son had fallen down the stairs, then admitting she panicked after realizing he was dead. Investigators concluded she had beaten him during an outburst of rage, killed him, burned his remains in the backyard, and then staged an abduction to mislead police. The investigation revealed signs of prior abuse. Family members and caseworkers had noticed bruises on Daniel in the past, but Nakira's explanations always deflected suspicion. The trial, held in Cumberland County Superior Court, exposed those hidden horrors. Prosecutors argued that she had grown increasingly violent and detached, describing Daniel's final moments as a toddler trapped in terror. They presented surveillance evidence, text messages, and forensic findings that tied her directly to the killing and cover-up. The defense claimed postpartum depression and emotional instability, but the jury saw deliberate intent. On January 4th, 2023, the jury found Nakira Griner guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, second-degree desecration of human remains, second-degree child endangerment, and false public alarm. At her sentencing on February 21st, 2023, the Honorable Judge George Gangloff Jr., JSC, called her crime unspeakable cruelty against an innocent child. He sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, saying, "This court can find no justification, no excuse, and no words that can ever make sense of what you did." Nakira Griner is currently serving her life sentence at the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility for Women. In 2025, she appealed her conviction, arguing that the court erred in denying a defense expert and that the evidence was insufficient. However, in June 2025, the appellate division affirmed both her conviction and her life sentence, leaving her appeal denied and her punishment intact. In Bridgeton, the grief has never fully faded. Residents remember the night they joined the search for a missing boy, only to learn that the danger had come from within his own home. A small memorial still stands near the Griner family's yard. Flowers, a teddy bear, and a simple plaque engraved with his name, Daniel Jr. His story reshaped how local law enforcement handles missing child cases and deepened training for recognizing signs of hidden abuse. He was 2 years old, full of light, and never had a chance to grow up. For those who remember him, Daniel's name has become a promise, one that reminds New Jersey that every child's safety depends on someone noticing, speaking up, and refusing to look away. Case 5. Jeanine Glass, the Bathtub, death of her daughter, Florham Park, Morris County, 2025. On the evening of July 6, 2025, police officers in Florham Park, New Jersey, responded to a 911 call from a quiet suburban neighborhood. The caller was a man who had discovered his partner, 43-year-old Jeanine Glass, unresponsive on the floor of their bathroom. When first responders arrived, they revived Glass, but what they found moments later would turn a wellness check into a homicide investigation. Inside the same bathroom, face down in the tub, lay her 3-year-old daughter, lifeless and partially submerged in water. The child was rushed to Morristown Medical Center, where doctors confirmed what rescuers feared: she was already gone. The medical examiner would later determine that the little girl had died by drowning. Detectives from the Morris County Prosecutor's Office immediately launched an investigation, piecing together a sequence of events that pointed toward one chilling conclusion: this was no accident. According to the official reports, officers found no signs of forced entry or struggle. The only two people present in the home were Jeanine and her daughter. Neighbors told investigators that Glass had been acting erratically in the weeks leading up to the tragedy, withdrawing from family and friends and making cryptic social media posts about being tired and done. Those close to her said she had been struggling with emotional instability and marital issues, though no one could have imagined it would end like this. Over the following days, detectives collected evidence, interviewed witnesses, and reviewed medical records. On July 22, 2025, the Morris County Prosecutor's Office formally announced the arrest of Jeanine Glass, charging her with first-degree murder and second-degree endangering the welfare of a child. The timeline of events suggested that Glass may have first attempted to take her own life after killing her daughter, as she was found semi-conscious near the bathtub when police arrived. During her initial court appearance, Glass appeared pale and distant, speaking softly as the judge read the charges. Prosecutors described the crime as deeply disturbing, emphasizing the deliberate nature of the act. The defense requested a psychiatric evaluation, hinting at a possible mental health defense. The judge ordered that she be held without bail, pending trial at the Morris County Correctional Facility. The case immediately drew widespread attention across New Jersey for its haunting parallels to other tragic filicides, cases where mental illness, isolation, or emotional collapse led mothers to take the lives of their own children. Prosecutor Robert J. Carroll stated, "This case is a reminder that even in the quietest neighborhoods, unimaginable suffering can hide behind closed doors." As of late 2025, Jeanine Glass remains in custody, awaiting trial on the murder charge. The court proceedings are expected to focus heavily on her mental state at the time of the crime. Her daughter's name has not been released publicly due to her age and the sensitive nature of the case. For the residents of Florham Park, the tragedy shattered the calm of a close-knit community. Neighbors left flowers, stuffed animals, and candles along the family's front walk in the days following the arrest. Some wrote messages that captured the heartbreak of the moment. Rest in peace, little angel. The story of Jeanine Glass is a haunting end to New Jersey's long list of maternal tragedies, a case where despair and silence met in the worst possible way. It is both a cry for justice and a reminder of the unseen mental battles that can turn a mother's love into something unrecognizable. Case 6. Jeanine LePage, The Tabernacle Family Murders, Burlington County, New Jersey, 2014. It was just after dawn on November 20th, 2014, when a frantic 911 call shattered the stillness of a quiet neighborhood on Holly Park Drive in Tabernacle, New Jersey. The caller's trembling voice reported hearing multiple gunshots coming from a nearby home. Within minutes, New Jersey state troopers arrived at the two-story house surrounded by pine trees and silence. What they found inside was a scene of unbearable devastation, one that would haunt the small Burlington County community for years. In the mother's bedroom lay 3 children, Nicholas Harriman, 14, Alexander Harriman, 11, and Nadia Harriman, 8, all found together on the same bed. Nicholas and Nadia were already gone when officers arrived, and their small bodies covered by blankets. Alexander was still alive, but critically injured. Beside him, his mother, 44-year-old Jeanine LePage, lay slumped on the floor, a legally owned .357 Magnum handgun beside her. Both were rushed to Cooper University Hospital in Camden, but neither would survive. Jeanine was pronounced dead 3 days later on November the 23rd, 2014, and Alexander succumbed to his injuries on November 26th. As investigators pieced together the events, the grim timeline became clear. Before dawn, Jeanine had quietly entered her children's room, one by one placing a pillow over their heads and pulling the trigger to muffle the shots. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle, only stillness. After killing her children, she turned the gun on herself. The 5 other relatives living in the home, including her parents and a sibling, slept through the entire ordeal, unaware of the horror unfolding just down the hall. The crime left investigators stunned. The lack of a suicide note, message, or explanation made it almost impossible to understand what drove her to such a calculated act. Friends and neighbors described Jeanine as a loving, attentive mother, someone who doted on her children, baked for school events, and volunteered locally. To the outside world, she was the picture of warmth and devotion, but inside, she was collapsing under the weight of severe depression and emotional exhaustion. Family members later told police that Jeanine had been struggling for months, withdrawing from those closest to her. She had spoken about feeling overwhelmed and trapped, but no one believed her despair would turn violent. She had recently separated from her husband and was trying to balance financial hardship with the pressures of single motherhood. The quiet loneliness of those months, combined with untreated mental illness, would ultimately prove fatal, not only for her, but for her children as well. At a press conference, Burlington County Prosecutor Robert Bernardi called it a tragedy beyond words, a family destroyed in silence. The community's grief was palpable. In the days that followed, hundreds gathered for a candlelight vigil in Tabernacle Park. 4 lanterns were lit, one for each life lost. Children from the local school brought handwritten notes and teddy bears, leaving them at the LePage home's front steps. Pastors urged families to check on loved ones struggling with depression, to speak up before pain becomes violence. The LePage family murders would later become a touchstone for mental health reform advocates throughout New Jersey. The story was used in community seminars and crisis intervention programs as a heartbreaking reminder of how untreated depression can spiral into catastrophic consequences. It forced conversations about how isolation, stigma, and silence can push even the most devoted parents past the point of return. Nearly a decade later, the house on Holly Park Drive has changed hands, but the memories within those walls never left. Longtime residents still speak softly when passing by, recalling the 3 children whose laughter once filled those rooms and the mother whose unseen anguish turned that laughter into silence. For Tabernacle, the tragedy of Jeanine LePage stands as a wound that never fully healed, a story not of malice but of mental illness ignored and the terrible cost of a pain no one saw coming. Case 7. Michelle Heal, the death of baby Mason, Toms River, New Jersey, 2012 to 2015. On the afternoon of August 28, 2012, a frantic 911 call came from a quiet neighborhood in Toms River, New Jersey. The voice on the line was that of Michelle Heal, a 44-year-old mother of twins who also worked as a trusted babysitter. Her tone was urgent and panicked. "The baby's not breathing?" The baby was 14-month-old Mason Hess, a little boy she had cared for since infancy. When paramedics arrived, they found Mason unresponsive and struggling to breathe. He was rushed to Jersey Shore University Medical Center, where doctors discovered catastrophic brain injuries, spinal trauma, and retinal hemorrhaging, signs consistent with violent shaking. For 4 agonizing days, doctors fought to keep Mason alive, but the damage was irreversible. On September 1st, 2012, he was pronounced dead. The medical examiner ruled his death a homicide, citing blunt cerebral trauma and spinal shock caused by inflicted force. In her initial statement, Heal told investigators that Mason had choked on applesauce and gone limp after she patted him on the back to clear his airway, but medical experts quickly ruled out that explanation. The nature and severity of his injuries, especially the combination of brain swelling, bleeding, and spinal damage, could not have been caused by mild impact. Detectives concluded that Mason had been violently shaken or slammed in a moment of uncontrolled anger. The case stunned the community. Heal had been a close friend of Mason's parents, trusted completely to care for their son while both parents worked. Her husband and Mason's father even worked in the same prosecutor's office. Because of that conflict, the case was transferred to Monmouth County Superior Court in Freehold. The trial was emotionally charged, lasting weeks and filled with opposing medical testimony. The prosecution argued that Heal's frustration led to a fatal outburst, an act of rage disguised as panic. The defense countered that Mason's death was a tragic accident and that the shaken baby syndrome theory was medically flawed. In the courtroom, Mason's parents wept as graphic medical photographs were shown. The tension was palpable. On April 17, 2015, the jury reached its decision. Heal was acquitted of murder, but found guilty of aggravated manslaughter and endangering the welfare of a child. During sentencing on June 26, 2015, Judge Francis J. Vernoya told her, "You were entrusted with the care of a child who could not protect himself. What happened was not an accident. It was a betrayal of trust with irreversible consequences." He sentenced Heal to 15 years in New Jersey State Prison, requiring her to serve at least 12 years and 9 months under the No Early Release Act before becoming eligible for parole. Today, Michelle Heal remains incarcerated, continuing to maintain her innocence. Her supporters claim that outdated and controversial medical interpretations of shaken baby syndrome contributed to her conviction, while Mason's family continues to grieve the child they lost to an act of violence they'll never understand. The case remains one of New Jersey's most emotionally divisive child homicide trials, a story of friendship turned tragedy, science clashing with emotion, and the devastating reminder that one moment of uncontrolled frustration can shatter countless lives forever. Case 8. Raquel Ramirez, the death of little Danielle, Union County, New Jersey, 2014 to 2021. It was the cold evening of February 2nd, 2014, when officers in Union County, New Jersey were dispatched to a small apartment following a frantic 911 call. Inside, they found 2-year-old Danielle Orozco lying unresponsive on a bed, her tiny body covered in bruises. Her mother, Raquel Ramirez, and the child's father, Jorge Orozco, stood nearby, offering conflicting stories of what had happened. At first, they claimed the child had fallen. Later, they said she'd been playing too rough, but nothing they said could explain the sheer extent of the injuries visible on Danielle's fragile frame. Paramedics rushed Danielle to the hospital, but it was too late. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The autopsy findings would later reveal the horrific truth of what she had endured. Danielle's death was caused by blunt force trauma and catastrophic internal injuries. Her ribs were cracked, her lungs and kidneys bruised, and her spleen torn apart. She had hemorrhages on both sides of her brain, the kind of injuries consistent not with an accident, but with repeated and forceful blows. The medical examiner testified that the level of violence inflicted upon her was comparable to the force of a high-speed car crash. Even more disturbing were the 4 human bite marks found on Danielle's body, on her face, arm, abdomen, and back. One was fresh, inflicted just hours before she died. When questioned about these marks, Raquel Ramirez claimed they were simply kisses or suck marks, a statement prosecutors later described as an insult to the truth and to the child she failed to protect. Both parents were arrested and charged with murder and child endangerment. During the joint trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of sustained abuse. Expert witnesses detailed a pattern of injuries that had occurred over time, proving Danielle's death was the culmination of ongoing brutality. Neighbors testified that they often heard yelling and crying from the apartment, but no one intervened. The defense for Ramirez argued that she did not deliver the fatal blows herself, portraying her as a mother who was passive, negligent, and overwhelmed, but not intentionally murderous. After weeks of testimony, the jury rejected the murder charge, but held her responsible for her child's death. Raquel Ramirez was acquitted of murder, but convicted of second-degree reckless manslaughter and second-degree endangering the welfare of a child. The jury found that her reckless indifference and failure to protect Danielle directly caused the child's death. In 2014, she was sentenced to 8 years in prison for manslaughter, subject to New Jersey's No Early Release Act, NERA, which requires her to serve 85% of the sentence before being eligible for parole. She initially received an additional 8-year sentence for child endangerment to run consecutively, but that conviction would later be overturned. Years of appeals followed as her attorneys argued over technicalities and jury instructions. Finally, on April 14, 2021, the New Jersey Supreme Court delivered its ruling in State v. Raquel Ramirez and Jorge Orozco. The court affirmed Ramirez's conviction for reckless manslaughter, confirming that her inaction and deceit directly contributed to her daughter's fatal injuries. However, it reversed her conviction for child endangerment, citing errors in how the jury had been instructed. The decision did little to ease the heartbreak surrounding Danielle's death. The court acknowledged that while Ramirez may not have struck the final blow, her criminal indifference, her willingness to look away while her child was beaten, starved, and bitten, made her equally culpable. For many, this case remains one of the most haunting examples of parental neglect in New Jersey's history, a reminder that silence, fear, and complicity can be just as deadly as violence itself. Little Danielle's story stands as a testament to every child who suffers unseen, waiting for someone to step in before it's too late. Case 9. Shamir Harris, the starvation and murder of a 4-year-old boy, Franklin Township, New Jersey, 2025. On the cold afternoon of February 19, 2025, a 911 call came from a modest hotel in Franklin Township, Somerset County, New Jersey. The caller, a 36-year-old man named Sean Tate, told dispatchers that his young son was unresponsive. His voice trembled as he claimed the boy had fallen off a toilet a few days earlier and had been acting strangely ever since. When first responders arrived, they found a small, frail boy lying on the hotel bed. His skin was pale and tight against his bones, his frame skeletal, his eyes sunken, and his breathing absent. The paramedics tried desperately to revive him, but within minutes, and the truth was clear, the child was already gone. At the hospital, doctors confirmed what the emergency crew had suspected. This was not a sudden accident or an unexpected illness. The boy's tiny body told the story of prolonged suffering. He was severely malnourished, with almost no body fat left. There were bruises on his arms, legs, and torso, old injuries fading into new ones. His ribs and spine protruded sharply under his skin. The medical examiner's report would later describe the cause of death as a combination of blunt force trauma and chronic neglect, ruling it a homicide. What they found most disturbing was that this child had endured this agony for weeks, possibly months, before his body finally gave out. The victim, whose name has been withheld due to his young age, was just 4 years old. A child who should have been playing, learning, and laughing spent his final days starving in silence. Investigators soon discovered that the boy had been living in that hotel room with his parents. Shamir Harris, 26, and Sean Tate, 36. Both appeared unemotional and detached when questioned. Harris claimed she had last seen her son alive only 2 hours before the call. Tate repeated his story about a fall from the toilet, insisting the boy was fine until suddenly becoming unresponsive. But detectives and doctors knew immediately. Those stories didn't add up. The Somerset County Prosecutor's Office launched a full investigation. They found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of an intruder, and no indication of accidental trauma consistent with the parents' version of events. What they did find was chilling neglect. The family had been living in that hotel for weeks. Food was scarce, and the child's living conditions were appalling. Investigators believed the boy had been systematically deprived of food and medical care, left to waste away while the parents concocted lies to explain his condition. When the autopsy results came back on February 4th, 2025, they confirmed the worst fears. This was not neglect, born of ignorance, but of cruelty. The child's organs showed signs of starvation. His stomach was nearly empty, and his bones revealed chronic malnutrition. The bruising patterns suggested repeated abuse over time, not one isolated event. His death was ruled a homicide caused by a combination of physical trauma and prolonged neglect. After weeks of investigation, both parents were arrested. Shamir Harris was taken into custody at her workplace in Linden, while Sean Tate was arrested later that same day in Woodbridge. They were each charged with first-degree murder and second-degree endangering the welfare of a child. Prosecutors said the pair had conspired to hide their abuse behind a web of lies, choosing deception over compassion until it was too late. Both remain held without bail at the Somerset County Jail, awaiting trial. The news of the boy's death spread quickly across New Jersey, breaking hearts and stirring outrage. A small candlelight vigil formed outside the hotel within days of the arrests. Strangers left teddy bears and notes on the steps. Their messages simple but profound. You deserved love. Rest now, little one. We failed you. Residents wept openly, struggling to comprehend how any parent could watch their child wither away and do nothing. Prosecutors described the case as one of the most harrowing examples of parental cruelty in recent memory. In a press statement, Somerset County Prosecutor John P. McDonald said, "This was not a moment of rage or neglect. It was a prolonged campaign of suffering. This child's body told us everything his voice could not." As of late 2025, the case is still moving through the courts, with both Harris and Tate facing potential life sentences if convicted. The story of their son, an innocent child who suffered in silence, has reignited conversations about the hidden epidemic of child abuse in America and the importance of vigilance within communities. For the people of Franklin Township, this case is more than a crime. It's a wound. A reminder that monsters don't always hide in the dark. They can live under the same roof, behind the same doors, and carry the same last name. The boy's short life, marked by hunger and heartbreak, stands as a plea to see what's hidden, to speak when others stay silent, and to remember that love, neglected, can become lethal. Case 10, Heather Barbera, the Ventnor double homicide, Atlantic County, New Jersey, 2018 to 2020. On the morning of July 8, 2018, a maintenance worker at a high-rise condominium in Ventnor City, New Jersey, knocked on the door of an 8th-floor apartment after receiving complaints that no one had seen the elderly residents in days. When no one answered, he entered and stumbled upon a crime scene so brutal that first responders later called it pure savagery. Inside, police found 87-year-old Catherine Sue Kaufman and her daughter, 67-year-old Michelle Gordon, lying motionless on the living room floor. Both women had been beaten to death with a nightstick. The killer turned out to be Heather Barbera, Michelle's 42-year-old daughter and Catherine's granddaughter. After the murders, she ransacked the apartment, stealing jewelry, cash, and credit cards before fleeing to New York City. For 2 days, she used her dead relatives' credit cards to shop, dine, and stay in hotels, leaving a digital trail that led detectives right to her. Barbera was arrested on July 11, 2018 at the Port Authority bus terminal. When confronted, she quickly confessed, telling investigators that she and her mother had argued violently that morning and that her grandmother tried to intervene. In her own words, she said it just got out of hand. The autopsy later revealed multiple skull fractures and blunt force trauma injuries consistent with a prolonged beating. Prosecutors described the attack as one of fury and greed, a burst of rage followed by calculated theft. The investigation revealed that Heather had been living a turbulent life marked by drug abuse, financial instability, and estrangement from her family. She had recently moved back in with her mother and grandmother, hoping to get her life together, but tensions quickly reignited. Friends said her relationship with her mother was toxic, volatile arguments followed by brief reconciliations. On the day of the murders, prosecutors believe a dispute over money turned deadly. During interrogation, Heather broke down and cried, but showed little empathy for her victims. She told detectives she didn't mean to kill them, but her actions afterward, looting their home and fleeing, spoke otherwise. Charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, robbery, and theft, she faced life in prison. At her sentencing on January 9, 2020, Superior Court Judge Bernard DeLury Jr. called her actions unimaginable cruelty against the very people who gave you everything. Heather Barbera accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to aggravated manslaughter in both deaths. She was sentenced to 42 years in state prison under the No Early Release Act, meaning she must serve at least 36 years before becoming eligible for parole. Today, Barbera remains incarcerated at the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility for Women. She will be in her late 70s before she can ever walk free again. For the Ventnor community, the killings shattered the peace of a quiet beachfront town. Residents who had known Catherine and Michelle for decades still leave flowers at the building's entrance each July, remembering them as kind, gentle women whose final moments were stolen by someone they loved and trusted most. The case of Heather Barbera remains one of the most shocking family crimes in South Jersey history, a grim reminder that evil doesn't always come from strangers and that sometimes the greatest betrayals happen within the walls of home. Case 11, Heather Reynolds, the murder of little Axel, Sicklerville, Camden County, New Jersey, 2018 to 2022. On the morning of May 10th, 2018, emergency responders were called to a quiet residential street in Sicklerville, Camden County. The caller was a frantic mother, Heather Reynolds, then 41 years old, who claimed she'd found her 17-month-old son, Axel, unresponsive. Paramedics arrived to find the little boy lying motionless on the front lawn. His lips were blue, his body limp. Heather clutched him in her arms, sobbing, insisting she had no idea what had happened. But within moments, trained eyes began to sense that something wasn't right. There were faint traces of residue around Axel's nose and mouth, and the pattern of bruising didn't match accidental suffocation. Detectives soon noticed that Heather's behavior alternated between hysterical crying and eerie calm. She asked whether she was free to leave before medical personnel had even finished their assessment. The toddler was rushed to Jefferson Hospital in Washington Township, but it was too late. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The autopsy results would change everything. Forensic examiners found chemical traces consistent with the cleansing wipes commonly used in households, compounds capable of suffocating a small child when pressed over the nose and mouth. Investigators also discovered methamphetamine in Heather's system at the time of the incident. The Camden County Prosecutor's Office concluded that Axel's death was not an accident. It was deliberate. As the investigation unfolded, a disturbing motive emerged. Heather, married with 2 other children, had been involved in an extramarital affair and was spiraling into drug addiction. According to prosecutors, she saw her young son as an obstacle to her reckless lifestyle and to the affair she was desperate to continue. In their words, she killed Axel to get him out of the way. In June 2019, Heather Reynolds was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, possession of methamphetamine, and endangering the welfare of a child. She maintained her innocence, claiming Axel's death was a tragic accident, but the physical evidence and her shifting stories told a different truth. Her trial began in July 2022, a 9-day courtroom drama that left jurors visibly shaken. Witnesses described a woman consumed by addiction and self-interest. The prosecution presented forensic evidence of chemical burns consistent with suffocation by a cleansing wipe, as well as messages showing Reynolds seeking attention from her lover just hours after Axel's death. In one message, she wrote that her life was finally calm again. After deliberating less than a day, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty of murder and child endangerment, she was acquitted of a separate conspiracy charge in a murder-for-hire case involving her former boyfriend. On November 15, 2022, Superior Court Judge Gwendolyn Blue sentenced Heather Reynolds to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At the hearing, the courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor read from a letter written by Axel's grieving father. "You took away a piece of my soul that will never come back," Judge Blue told Reynolds. "Your son should have been your greatest joy, not your burden. What you did was beyond cruel. It was inhuman." Today, Heather Reynolds remains incarcerated at the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility for Women, appealing her conviction. The appellate division heard arguments in 2025, but her life sentence still stands. The story of little Axel left the community shattered. Neighbors who had once seen Heather walking her children down the street couldn't fathom that the same woman could end a life so small, so defenseless. Outside the family's Sicklerville home, people placed teddy bears, white balloons, and a note that read, "You were too pure for this world." The case of Heather Reynolds stands as one of the most disturbing filicides in modern New Jersey history. A mother who chose drugs and desire over the innocent life she created. It's a story of addiction, deceit, and irreversible loss, reminding us that beneath even the calmest suburban surface, unimaginable darkness can sometimes hide. Case 12. Naomi Elkins, A Mind Unraveled. Lakewood, New Jersey, 2024. It was the morning of June 25, 2024, when police in Lakewood, New Jersey, were called to a quiet home on Arlington Avenue. What they found inside would leave even the most seasoned investigators shaken. Standing near the bathroom door was 27-year-old Naomi Elkins, trembling, her voice flat and distant. Inside, the air was heavy with steam and silence. In 2 separate bathrooms lay her daughters, Miriam, just 3 years old, and Hannah, barely 1. both were gone. The investigation would reveal an act both heartbreaking and horrifying. Naomi had first stabbed her younger daughter, Hannah, plunging a kitchen knife into the baby's stomach before placing her in the bathtub and holding her underwater. Moments later, she walked to the second bathroom where she drowned her 3-year-old Miriam, counting aloud as she held her beneath the water. To 50, she told police later, believing she was removing evil from the world. This was not a story of hatred or cruelty. It was a story of untreated psychosis and a mind lost to delusion. Naomi had long suffered from severe schizoaffective disorder and postpartum psychosis, but in the months before the tragedy, she had stopped taking her medication. Family members noticed her behavior changing. She spoke of seeing visions, of hearing divine instructions. She became convinced that she or her husband had been chosen as a kind of Messiah, tasked with saving humanity through sacrifice. On that June morning, the delusion consumed her completely. She believed drowning her daughters would cleanse the world of sin, that she was saving them, not killing them. When police arrived, Naomi spoke calmly, detached from reality, describing her actions as if they were part of a ritual. Officers and paramedics wept openly at the scene. The Lakewood community was paralyzed with grief. Vigils were held for Miriam and Hannah, where neighbors and strangers gathered to light candles, pray, and speak about the need for compassion and awareness. Parents held their children tighter. Religious leaders called for understanding, not blame, urging the public to see how untreated mental illness could twist faith and love into tragedy. As the case moved through the courts, it became clear that Naomi's crime had not come from malice, but from a complete psychological break. Forensic psychiatrists described her as acutely psychotic and unable to discern right from wrong. In April 2025, Judge Guy P. Ryan ruled her not guilty by reason of insanity. He ordered Naomi Elkins committed to a secure psychiatric facility for 2 life terms, the legal equivalent of 150 years, ensuring she would remain under treatment indefinitely. In his ruling, Judge Ryan said softly, "This is not about evil. This is about a mind overcome by illness, one that society failed to reach in time." His words echoed across New Jersey, reigniting conversations about postpartum psychosis, medication access, and the stigma that keeps struggling mothers silent. Since then, Naomi has remained under intensive psychiatric care. Doctors say she now experiences lucid periods and fully understands what she did, moments that leave her broken with guilt. She reportedly asks about her daughters every day. In Lakewood, the 2 girls are remembered as symbols of both innocence and change. Their names have been invoked in mental health awareness events and early intervention programs. For many, the Elkins tragedy became a call to action, to build systems that recognize the warning signs, to support mothers facing mental health crises, and to break the silence around psychosis and postpartum illness. This case is not one of excuses or justification. It is a story of loss of 2 lives ended far too soon, and a mother's mind consumed by illness. But it is also a reminder that mental health is not optional, that treatment saves lives, and that compassion and vigilance can prevent the unthinkable. Naomi's story pleads with all of us to notice the signs, to reach out before the darkness takes hold, and to never let another family suffer in silence. We tell stories like this not to sensationalize, but to raise awareness. We do not excuse or support acts of violence. Every victim deserves remembrance and justice. But awareness saves lives too, because every tragedy that begins in silence can end in prevention. If someone you know is struggling, don't look away. Listen. Encourage them to seek help. Because healing starts with awareness, and awareness starts with us.